Richard E. Wagner, our speaker this evening, our keynote speaker for this conference, is the Harris Professor of Economics at George Mason University. He graduated from Mr. Jefferson's School, University of Virginia, under James Buchanan in 1966. Apparently he was about 4 at the time. He's taught at the University of California, Irvine, at Tulane, at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, I love this one, at the University of Constance, at Auburn University, from which institution I earned my own PhD, at Florida State, and now at George Mason University. He's quite well known for many things, including his co-authored book with James Buchanan from 1977, Democracy in Deficit, a real classic of, I would say, of economics, but certainly a classic of public choice theory. His 2010 volume, Mind, Society, and Human Action, contains contains a substantial treatment of the entanglement problem. Today we have a whole community of sort of Austro-public choice economists, Austrian economists who are at the same time also public choice economists, or public choice economists, at the same time also Austrian economists. Dick is the original of this. I think he was really the first in that category. It was so nominated, if I'm not mistaken, by Randy Holcomb in his recent contribution to the Butke-Coyne Handbook on Austrian Economics that's coming out. And that's now become kind of just standard. I think that's a huge change that Dick has had a lot, an important role in. Richard studies macroeconomic phenomena, and he views them as, studies macroeconomics, he views macro phenomena as emergent rather than objects of choice. His entanglement notion of entanglement was first broached in his 2007 book on public finance, Fiscal Sociology and the Theory of Public Finance, and is treated again in the 2010 book, as I mentioned earlier, and some articles, including his Great Tarp article, co-authored with someone named Adam Smith. I just love that. And he has revisited it again in his recently published 2012 book, Deficits, Debt, and Democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really happy to present to you Professor Richard Wagner.
Thank you, Roger. It's always daunting to sometimes hear yourself introduced. I wondered if you're going to match up the introduction, but before I even try, I'm going to pass out something here. I'll start each direction. I made a PowerPoint, but we're not projecting PowerPoints today. And you see this handout begins on page 32. That's because this is the figures and tables to the manuscript I prepared for this. The manuscript I prepared is titled Main Street, Wall Street, and City Hall, Entanglement and the Theory of Political Economy. And I will refer to these figures. They're not the beautiful figures because when I tried to copy and paste my PowerPoint figures into my Word document, they ran off the edges, they got scrunched up, I didn't have time to fix them, and so I just did some screenshots of it all and put it on 3 pages, but I will have occasion to refer to these. As we already discussed in our morning session, I view the entanglement idea is really an old idea. It goes back then to Adam Smith, as Maria was saying this morning, that it's a product of thinking of economics as a genuine social science, with society as the design object, as against economics being reduced to some typical or representative agent in his or her choices as comprising the subject matter of economics. And so in that way it's something very old. Now economics as social theory then is the vision that I have of entangled political economy, just an extension of that idea. And I think in that respect, that standard notions of political economy conceptualize their object inaptly or wrongly. That raises the issues of, I think, some significant methodological issues I want to discuss first, then get into a review of additive political economy, as I call it, then entangled, then go into some constitutional implications, and then wrap up. And I'll get my watch out, so I wrap up before midnight. So, first, some methodological preliminaries. We should always remember when we're talking about an object we don't see. We don't apprehend with our senses. No one's ever seen an economy, a polity, a political economy. Sure, you've seen a city hall, you've seen a grocery store, but you don't see the objects that we're talking about in our theories, and some of those objects are theoretically constructed. That in turn means that there are choices made in how we theorize about those objects. We are all, in that way, in that position of that late in the Republic when Plato discusses his prisoners in the cave. You know, there's that fire burning outside and these figures are dancing and what's going on. That we have to construct frameworks for even apprehending the objects of our interest and our concern. And I think there are different paths for doing that. I think the basic paths are old paths. They're represented, I think, in the dichotomy between Ecclesiastes and Heraclitus. Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun, where Heraclitus says you can't even step twice in the same river. Now, I think it's possible to hold both and entertain both, but you have to make a choice of foreground and background. There is that old aphorism, the more things change, the more they stay the same, that I think captures that very nicely. There's also that old joke that I've heard many times over the years, and I'm sure you have too. It's about the economist at this convention, outside somewhere in some darkened street where there's one lone street light shining, and the economist is kneeling down and is asked, "What are you looking for?" He said, "My car key." "Did you lose it here?" "No." "Well, why are you looking here?" "Because the light isn't good here." And so, you know, people, when they hear that story, they typically chuckle themselves, which I think says to me that there's some discomforting element of truth there about, as I sometimes expressed, if the only tool you have is a hammer, the whole world is a nail. And I think that would say that if you think you're not looking in the right place, don't you need to think about how you might build a different light to allow you to look where you think the key really might be? And that's what I'm really looking myself as involved in. Now, there's a, ontologically speaking, methodological preliminaries here, I would ask you to consider two different kinds of social configuration, both of which correspond to notions of orderliness. One is a parade. The other is a crowd of people passing through a busy, bustling piazza. Both of those configurations are orderly in the sense that anyone can figure out how to navigate through them. But ontologically, those are very different sources of order, forms of order, that how they work are very different. If we talk about the parade, we would ask, well, what are its qualities? We would put it in terms of the amount of rehearsal time, the marching abilities of the members of the parade, the musical abilities of the members of the parade, the abilities of the parade marshal. None of those things are relevant for the piazza. To talk about the orderliness of the piazza, you would make reference to such things as the ability of people to read each other's minds, to gauge walking speeds, so as to avoid collisions because people don't really like to treat each other as bumper cars in a carnival. Principles of courtesy, like walking on the right side of the pathway rather than the left. Those kinds of things is how you would describe the orderliness of the piazza. Now, there's a question you might ask about epistemological issues here that I would think to look at too. About goodness of fit in particular. Suppose you take a simple framework of, say, 100 people in a field. Suppose in the spirit of Thomas Schelling and his micromotives and macro behavior, or Mitchell Resnick in the spirit of his turtles, termites, and traffic jams. You have 100 people in a field, they're linked together because they are a society, and society is the object of interest. And they're linked together in a sense that if you imagine that field divided into small squares, but each member tries to stay, not get farther away, say, than 4 squares, nor get closer than, say, 2. And then these 100 members, okay, what I'm going to ask you to think of it as a kind of a process through time, where 5 of them set off, they make some move to some new location. We might think about this as an abstract commodity space where these are entrepreneurs who think of a new location for doing their business. Now, by then these rules of social interaction, there's going to be an adjustment on the remainder to stay within those distances that I set up to begin with. And so we have a 2-step sequence that, in terms of 95% goodness of fit kinds of ideas, fits an equilibrium system with an exogenous shock and a re-equilibration. It fits perfectly within that epistemological framework. But it's totally false in terms of the character of the object, which is a live, moving organism that is being led by entrepreneurial actions about where future possibilities lie, which recurs back to another one of those Central Europeans, Joseph Schumpeter, who, in his Theory of Economic Development, was first published in 1911, although not translated until 1934, talked about entrepreneurship as being the locus of leadership in a capitalist society. That is, that you have a leadership, meaning then what you have, what you're describing, is a process of motion, but the directions of motion are determined through entrepreneurial activities about where to go from today to tomorrow. And so in Schumpeter's vision, that was the entrepreneurial energy in society. And so the ontological nature of the object, in my judgment, is that living organism that has entrepreneurial guidance to it, and that it so happens, at least in the setup I gave you, that it also would correspond to typical goodness of fits at the 5% significance level. You cannot reject the hypothesis of a stationary equilibrium, but yet the object was alive and moving. And that was the nature of the object. Now let me give you a different example, because what mischief can come about by treating a piazza as if it were a parade instead? If your model is that of a parade, but the object is truly a piazza. Well, suppose I change the piazza image a little bit. Suppose I ask you to imagine an arena or a stadium, make it horseshoe shaped, and put it at a bend in a river. Why a bend in a river? Well, because if it's horseshoe shaped, the only way out is away from the river. Now suppose at the end of the horseshoe, that happens to be Ohio State University's name of the stadium too, but at the other end of, and it's football season, at the other end of the horseshoe, you got a mile down the road, are parking lots. So you have, the event is over, the crowd leaves, down the boulevard, racing for their cars. Now suppose you're in a hot air balloon, 10,000 feet up there, hovering. You look down and what do you see? Well, if you're armed with economic theory, don't you see an imperfectly organized parade? Sure, they're all going in some general direction towards the cars, but some people are going faster than others, some people are going more in diagonal moves, and so on and so forth. And so you might be tempted to try to straighten out that imperfectly organized parade, but it isn't a parade anyway. It's something quite different, and I think a lot of mischief can come out of theorizing about a wrong object. And that's what table 1 in that pass out is about. I just put down 5 dichotomies. It goes back to another sort of image from Schumpeter, and this is in his very early in his history of economic analysis, where he talks about theoretical efforts starting with some kind of pre-analytical cognitive vision of your object, within the challenge being whether you can, how you can pursue that vision, where you can take it. And that dichotomy just shows some elements I put in here about my kind of sense of what a theory of society should look like compared to what I regard as orthodox economic theories of society. And so I think societies is, in the right-hand column, is turbulent and moving. If I think of that as the object, I need a theory that fits turbulent and moving. It can't fit placid and static. I think of change as indigenous. It's quality inside of a society. It's not some kind of exogenous outside interjection into it. And then this entanglement politic external versus policy residing in economy and vice versa. And I'll skip on, leave the rest aside to go on. But that, if you start from the object and what you sense to be its nature, then I think the question is, what kind of theoretical framework might allow you to work with that object to flesh out and develop some of its features and some of its properties, and that's what I regard the entanglement about. The additive political economy looks like a billiard table. It is a billiard table in the models. That's what figure 1 there illustrates. A standard kind of political economy model where the basic orientation is the first draft, you might say, to use an academic language, of social life is written in the marketplace, and the manuscript then being perfected or polished or distorted, whichever you prefer to say, within the polity. And so that, within the new political economy, then elections are conceptualized as ways of choosing a median voter with the median voter's preferences, then choosing the full set of economic policies going forward. And so what this shows then is a median voter who's going to be shifted to some alternative location, and which location is going to be chosen is going to be a product of the election that reveals that. And so in that you have the polity as a single-headed, single-minded object that is suitably modeled by a theory of choice, and an economy is likewise a fully connected entity that's equilibrated and can be moved and acted upon as a single unit. And that's what figure 1 aims to show. And I contrast that with the entanglement, and that's what figure 2 is about. It's my way of representing what I had in mind in 3 stages, where that panel A that showed the single objects of economy and polity as just there. Then I show entanglement in 2 stages. One is to realize that economy isn't this equilibrated entity, but rather is an ecologically oriented kind of entity of multiple independent actors. And the same thing true for polity, of not one single entity in a democratic system, but multiple kinds of entities. And the third stage, that panel C, then says, well, they don't occupy separate territories, but they all operate on the same territory. And so that third panel just says, well, let's put them all together. And that's what I mean by entanglement. Now, entanglement, though, comes with architecture. And that's one of the things that I'm so fond of with Jane Jacobs and her Systems of Survival, is the importance she gave to architecture. And she recognized entanglement. And she talked about different kinds of patterns of commingling, of carriers of different kinds of activities, what she called commercial, what she called guardian. And down on figure 3, I just drew in 3 illustrations of possible patterns. The first one, A, there is no entanglement. The political and economic entities don't interact. Panels B and C just give illustrations of interaction, with panel C showing perhaps a greater extent of commingling than panel B, but they don't show the commingling in any case. And this is a frame of analysis. Then that important work does depend upon the architecture of the entanglement. And another figure that I regard as, not a figure, but another person I regard as important in some of these formulations is an Italian fellow from early in the 20th century, when he started late in the 19th century, Maffeo Pantaleone, who talked about, in 1911, systems of political pricing where political entities bore a parasitical relationship to market-based entities in a technical sense, the technical sense being that market entities can generate revenues directly by supplying and selling services to customers. Political entities don't generate revenue by selling services directly to customers, but rather attach themselves parasitically to market transactions through a system of taxation in one form or another. And with the different forms of taxation then having significant amount of work to do. Now, and finally, actually I figure 4 and 5. But the entanglement idea then is that unavoidably commercial entities are going to be mixed in with politics and vice versa. But to what effect, to what consequence, I think will depend upon the forms of entanglement, because different forms of entanglement generate different kinds of relationships. Let me skip figure 4 and go on to figure 5 just for a moment to illustrate that. What I want to illustrate by figure 5 is 2 things. One is on the bottom part of that figure, which comes from an article published in Jibo some time ago. And the bottom part of that figure just shows the idea of entanglement of different kinds of entities, all occupying some social space. So those entities are of different forms, politically organized, market organized. And I show those entities both as entities themselves, as nodes, and with various kinds of patterns of connection between them. Now, something I think is important that I want to take a couple moments on, because what we're interested in is in sort of the qualitative characteristics of societies under different architectural patterns, is the way in which those connections are crafted. that as we're talking about connections or relationships among entities, and one of the things I think entanglement does, now to think about that, and I think it's a part of economics and social science, is it transforms the interest away from an economics centered on resource allocations to an economics centered upon human relationships in their organization, with resource allocations coming out of that, because after all, resources can't do anything. Only people can do anything, and so the allocation of resources derives from the kinds of relationships among people, and so I think that naturally recurs then back to an economics focused on people, thoughts, plans, relationships, and so forth in the foreground of attention, with allocations then being results of the previous. Which means in turn, I think that the types of connective tissue, because now we're talking about the fabrication of connections and the work that that does for good or bad. After all, one of Jane Jacobs's formulations ran in terms of monstrous moral hybrids, and kind of a sense that some kinds of patterns of connections can be, in some socially relevant sense, can be damaging. And so, if you want to explore that possibility, you need to have an analytical framework that allows that possibility to have room to breathe. And so, then that means that the connective tissue that becomes important, and that's actually what I referred to in figure 4, shows two different kinds of connective tissue being fabricated. If you talk about the normal market kinds of transactions, what we mean by market transactions typically would be connections that are fabricated through an ongoing interest in commercial dealings, typically over some indefinite period of time extending forward. That is, often in our examples, we think about transactions as spot transactions. One transaction, you're in and out. Whereas most commercial transactions are not spot transactions, but are continuing transactions, as I think conveyed, for instance, by the idea of relational contracts, as against the idea of a simple contract that's in and out. Both kinds exist, but I think the relational ones are the more significant ones. And in there, I think there's strong tendencies and reasons to support basically forthrightness and honesty in the pursuit of sustainable commercial relationships. It's an arena where you find if relationships are going to continue, and definitely participants aren't doing themselves any good by going into these relationships without being forthright in what they anticipate and what they're thinking about and what they hope to achieve. And so I think in dyadic relationships you have a kind of a consensual weaving of connections. That's why I think most of this price rigidity stuff in macro is wrong-headed, because it's not in commercial relationships that you find price rigidity as a problem, where because contracts are renegotiated continually. Where you find price rigidity a problem is whenever you have public ordering intruding into market relationships, whether it be labor law that can't be breached, which leads to bankruptcy as a way of getting out of contracts and so forth. All those kinds of things is where the so-called rigidity, I think, comes into play, because there you have a different kind of connective tissue that is partly fabricated under duress, because the nature of the triadic contract relationship, as Marta sketched this afternoon in her commentary, is one of both some parties gaining is what we mean by a gain, other parties being duressful partners to that contract. And what if we're talking about relationship, then what becomes the nature of the connective tissue under different principles by which those relationships become constructed, and what work does that do? Now, for instance, to give an example of what I mean in this context, consider the settlement of commercial disputes when they do arise. there is a literature in the law and economics of dispute resolution that finds, first of all, that commercial disputes are rare, going to trial. They're mostly civil. And part of that has to do, I think, with the institutional features within which those relationships are established. That is, both parties here are residual claimants, you might say, to their lawsuits. If they can settle a suit, a $10 million suit, they can settle it, that $10 million is theirs. It increases their net worth. Now suppose we change the setting, that one of the plaintiffs is now a public entity. Now I might add that in terms of plaintiffs these days in this country, the majority of suits plaintiffs are public plaintiffs and not private plaintiffs. What happens if you have a $10 million, the same $10 million suit now being filed by a public entity? There is no residual to claim to begin with. So you have a problem. Because the public entity doesn't want to just give the money back, it's a budgetary operation. Now, if there's no residual claimant, it's a budgetary operation. Now, you may have a district attorney who's ambitious, wants to become a governor. If so, a public suit can be a way of transforming budgetary revenues into investments in seeking higher office through the ability of rightly chosen suits to provide valuable coverage for the district attorney. It's not the only possible course that might be taken. You could also, the number of courses that could be taken, I think, limited by the imagination only. You could have another district attorney who wants to get into a lucrative private business practice, and perhaps can work with a calculus that suggests that some particular suits are more helpful to achieving that future position than others. You can likewise have a highly ideological charged candidate who thinks that there are some causes that are better to advance at public support than other causes, and can use a suit to advance those causes. The number of possibilities are basically, as I say, I think are limited by the imagination only. And it's the same situation that happens in rent control. It's really an example of applied rent control. That the one thing to know with rent control is that rent control will not control rents. That's a given. That because the very practice of rent control is going to set, for the same reason, is going to set in motion other kinds of developments. The classic type of illustration of that is the tying together of furniture sales with apartment rentals. Now, many cities that have rent control ordinances try to prohibit that kind of a contract, in which case you would be, I think, led to expect, well, what else can you do? Because the situation you have is there are more people who want a place to live than there are places for them to live. That's a fact. And so it's competition among the people who want places to live that is driving this process. And they're going to pay to get space. And if they can't pay for it by paying for furniture, maybe they'll pay for it by paying for membership in a club, as on the grounds that used to come along with the rent, but now is debundled, and so you can get the apartment, but you don't get the club. If you want the club, you got to pay separate for that. Maybe parking spaces that were once upon a time bundled with the apartment now are unbundled and are sold separately. All that rent control can do is change the texture by which commerce is done. It can't control rents. And I'd say by the same kind of token here, that you're going to get a different kind of organization of activity in this case, because you may talk about the $10 million settlement. That's on this figure 5, that $10 million in the aggregate for the district attorney's office is up there in the stratosphere, in that macro level. But if you want to explain what goes on in life, you have to connect that with action at the micro level, the ground level. And one of the thinnest, I think, most elegant books in economics is Jim Buchanan's Cost and Choice. And that's exactly what that book does. That choice and costs are intimately bound together. Cost is always the value of the option not taken. And so that means that cost is only a ground level object in this figure. The $10 million is irrelevant. That's a piece of ideology that's up there in the sky. It's not relevant for anything unless somehow it becomes relevant to the actor on the ground. Now, the residual clemency, that $10 million becomes relevant because it transmits directly into his or her bank account or net worth. But in terms of budgetary process, political processes, it doesn't become directly relevant. What becomes relevant then are the options, because the district attorney has options. You cannot spend the money. You can have excess money in your reserves, which means it can be swept over to some other department in some midterm budgetary review. Or you can let someone else do with it and so forth, or you can choose to do with it what you think you want to do with it. But whatever you do, it's the cost is the value a person places upon the option not taken. That road not taken is where cost resides. And so with that sort of in mind, in terms of then thinking about entanglement, of thinking about a social process is naturally going to have entanglement of, we all grew up in the same kind of society. People in similar, some people might go to the same schools, same churches, in different kinds of occupations. There are various ways in which I think entanglement becomes a very natural feature of society that doesn't get away from the question of the architectural organization of that entanglement and the work that it might do. And one of my favorite people just died. He and his wife died within a month of each other. Was Vincent Austrian. And he, in several works, I think, developed the important idea that government is inherently a Faustian bargain. By that he meant that it represented the use of an instrument of evil, which is the use of force in human relationships, under the hope that on balance you get more good than evil out of it, knowing that you're going to get both. And that makes me think that statistical decision theory, I think, has some important, I think, insight to bring into some of these kinds of issues, because I think one of the nice things about statistical decision theory is there is no perfection there. There is no perfection. You can't have perfection. The more you try to avoid doing one bad thing, the more of the other bad thing you're going to do. And that's the nature of the business. Now, in that kind of framework, what constitutional arrangements, I think, are forms of filters. You can have a, perhaps call it a fine-grained filter, if you will, that'll keep out most of the sentiment you don't want through, but you're also going to keep out a bit more of what you would like to get through. You have more of a coarse-grained filter, it's going to let more of what you want through, but it's also going to let more of what you don't want through. And so I think that kind of statistical decision framework, I think, corresponds, I think, in principle to the idea of different constitutional arrangements not being devices of perfection, because perfection doesn't exist at the ground level view of society, but rather as different kinds of filters that have different kinds of properties. Now, So last thing I'd say in closing about Entangled, then I want to say some things about the title, which I've forgotten, is that there's some people sometimes in the public choice literature ask, well, why isn't there more money in politics? And I find myself thinking, what do you mean by that? Take a bus ride. How many placards do you find on buses that refer to things political? Go to an arena and look at the placards there. How many advertisements do you find there that refer to things politically? Look at television shows, look at movies. Look at meetings of civic organizations and clubs and invited speakers and so forth. And I think those are all signs of entanglement. They're part of the social formations, the social life that we experience, that they all arise in the same territory, and the issues are not ones of, I think, of achieving separation, like that corral I showed in, I think, panel A of figure 2 or 3, whatever it is, but rather are more on the order of different architectural patterns along the lines of Jamie Jacobs. Now, I titled this paper Main Street, Wall Street, and City Hall, and I left out Wall Street. I didn't intend to leave out Wall Street. It was just how it worked. And by the time I proofed it and realized, oh, where'd Wall Street go? So let me, in closing, let me just say a word about where Wall Street will come in when I get back to revising this, because I put Wall Street between Main Street and City Hall for a purpose. I referred to entrepreneurship and Schumpeter in that example of the field in entrepreneurship providing movement, leadership. You might think of that as a kind of a cosmic drama. Life is a cosmic drama. We're all players in that drama. We choose our bits and our parts. Now for those who watch that drama, wherever they may be, whoever they may be, for an interesting drama, as we know, is going to have, sure, it's going to have participants, actors and actresses. It's going to have stage hands, set designers, costume designers, all those things. I think in the classical liberal style of political economy, the set designers, the stage hands, and so forth, that's the realm of the political. The upfront participation in the main action of the drama is on center stage. That was embodied or captured by Schumpeter's notion that entrepreneurship is the locus of leadership in a capitalist society. But if you think about any of those pictures, nodes, and connections that I have, what is there that keeps those nodes stable? There's nothing. There's desire to move elsewhere. There's resistance to encroachments on territory, but it's all, if I were to put this into motion, there's got to be principles of motion that are going to continually generate changes in the map of activities and enterprises that are also part of an ongoing, never-ending kind of process. And one of the things that we've seen clearly is that the political figures and political supporters have moved more and more onto center stage roles in this human drama. And I've been intrigued by the idea that Wall Street is an important part of that, because you say, if the locus of leadership is entrepreneurship, suppose you start from the presumption that at some, I use 5 out of 100 as an example. Take whatever number, that under principles of scarcity, we would say that whatever number of people might have ideas, entrepreneurial ideas, to try out in enterprises going forward, they won't all be able to get them financed. There's going to be some process that chooses which will receive support and which don't. Now there's going to be some institutional process by which that gets done, One kind of process would be a system of free banking, which means that the entrepreneurial direction for the future will be totally determined by interaction between those who provide sources of finance as portrayed perhaps in a standard model of supply and demand of loanable funds, and those who demand those funds for entrepreneurial activities. But is not finance, to recur to Nikolai Lenin, a form of commanding height in society? Because finance is where you can break into this link of who it is that's able to influence directions where the future is going to be. And if the action is really especially important in future directions of motion, then finance becomes a commanding height. That's why I put Wall Street as an intermediate position between there. It doesn't mean that you don't want to regulate airlines, because that might be important, but the ability, I think, especially, I'm inclined to think, resides in the realm of finance. And I didn't, in my text, but I didn't mention here, I put in a reference to the big players that Roger likes to, wrote that book about a few years ago, because you know, I drew all those nodes. My technology simply was I drew one node in PowerPoint and then copied it a number of times, and so they all have that same size. But I really should have big players, and also the importance, the second part of importance for Roger's work was in terms of the different kinds of connective tissue that exists, because in the big player framework, what's important isn't just the bigness, but it's the different kinds of connective tissue that exists, because the big player is not an ordinary residual claimant, which means they don't speak the same language as ordinary commercial participants. Just like in that example I gave in terms of settlement of disputes, two commercial disputants speak the same language of profit and loss. A dispute between a commercial entity and a public entity, they don't speak the same language. They speak different dialects, because one speaks the language of profit and loss, one speaks a language of who knows what, but it's a different kind of a language. And in terms of big players, just to close on a speculative note on this, I don't, Simon Biel and I just put out a paper on neutral money, and in it we have this speculation. It speaks to, it doesn't mean that power can't do wonderful things or it might not do screwy things. Both are possible. We have a speculation, suppose you go back to about 1500, when gold was coming into Spain from the New World. Now, suppose, now of course what the Spanish royalty did was frivol it away, and amusements and debauchery and all this sort of thing. But suppose they had invested it in sciences and engineering, put it into navigation, ballistics, explosives, armament, and then also in Spain, a few centuries before, you had this whole school of Salamanca, where you had the first laying out, I think, of really good ideas about spontaneous order, market systems, and so forth. And suppose they also invested then in the social sciences, economics, carrying forward those ideas that were present 2 centuries earlier. I think it's reasonable to speculate that we wouldn't even be talking about the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, Adam Smith. We'd be talking about David Ortiz and Maria Chavez, who would have carried forward that tradition. Would have been a history of the world different, but that would be a big player kind of effect, where the big player turned out differently. And all I'm saying is, I think in terms of thinking about economics as a genuine social science, that, and their object of inquiry is this object we can note as society as a living organism that's continually evolving, changing, and there is no entity that truly acts on society to change it. All action takes place internally. Some actors are bigger than other actors, which means they can do, on one hand, more damage, other hand, perhaps more good in some cases. It all depends. That's the kind of view of society that I think was the view of economics that was alive and well in economics well and late into the 19th century. And I think it's the view of economics that's going to come back again. And that's all I have to say. Thank you. I don't know if you have any questions, Roger, or are we just go to bar now, or
Let's
what?
take,
Easy day.
well, now,
I didn't get
when you put it that way.
Still waiting for you.
But to honor our host, the Worth Institute, I think we should have at least a little bit of a Q&A. And I guess I'll get the ball rolling by noting actually a quote from Heraclides that captures, I think, both the truth in Ecclesiastes and the truth that we more normally associate with Heraclides. He said, the sun is new every day. I just love that because it's the same sun. There's one sun. It comes up every day. It's the same. But no, every day it's new also. And somehow he's right that both those things are true at the same time.
Yeah, I think this is there's also this whole sort of distinction between philosophy centered on states and philosophy centered on processes that Stewart got into in his video conference this afternoon, expressing a very process-centric view of things that I think is right. And I think that was also very much the locus of the Austrian inspiration in economics, was it was process-centric. It doesn't mean there's not notions of state and structure there. I think it's a matter of foreground and background. And I think as historical creatures, I think it's the process orientation that speaks to our living together, the world we're going to experience, because we're all engaged as participants in a process by which, out of our interactions, is going to come the world we're going to experience down the road. And that doesn't mean that we're all equal in our ability to influence what we're going to experience either.
Another question?
We've talked a lot about entanglement as if it were a thing, or even entangled. Have you thought about ways of talking about the degrees of entangledness and what that implies?
I don't know if it's the same thing, but in some of the network literature, biological literature, there's notions of degeneracy that I think it's a little bit of a different notion, but that has to do with the number of alternative paths through a network that would be possible. I think that actually offers a good way to think about monopoly that's better than how it's currently thought about, because if you use a roadmap analogy, non-degeneracy would mean something like, if you wanted to go from New York to Vancouver, you had to go through Kansas City. There's no way you can avoid Kansas City. Where with degeneracy, there would be other paths. They may not be your preferable path. And you say that within the basic idea of private property and liberty of contract, it means that you as an entrepreneur are free to put together whatever entrepreneurial plans you have in mind. Now, in doing that, you have to secure permission from lots of participants. And you have to secure their permission. That's a genuine dialogue. You can't force anyone to participate in your plan, so you have to secure permission from all participants, whether it be to lease premises, to buy your products, to support your labor and so forth. It doesn't mean that you're going to get exactly the plan you want, because someone who you might hope to list in your plan has other plans for his or for her efforts. And so, but I think there is, I think that degeneracy, I think, as it's used, as I understand it, anyway, in this network symbology, I think is perhaps as close as I can think of. It's not exactly a measure, and I don't know, I would be kind of skeptical of how far I would think you could go in trying to objectify a notion of entanglement, because the idea refers to, in those diagrams I gave out, I used enterprises as political enterprises and market enterprises. The reason I did that was because I wanted to wrestle with this new literature on political economy that has taken shape over the last 20 or 30 years. I would say if you look at the history of thought, say, on political economy over the second half of the 20th century, you had standard welfare economics that was brought under attack with the development of public choice starting around 1960 or so, that then said the theme of the public choice ideas were that political officials had the same kinds of motivations as people in market enterprises, but they had different kinds of incentives. And so, because they could send the bill partly to other people, and so you get outcomes that by standard kinds of normative criteria in play at the time were what would be called Pareto inefficient. And then starting with Gary Becker in 1983 and going forward, Donald Whitman, Person Tavolini and so forth, you had development of a literature on new political economy that abolished that abolished political failure from the lexicon and said that basically politics is once again presumed to be Pareto efficient, and the vehicle for doing that was a framework in which the political entity was conceptualized as a billiards player that acted upon a market entity. And the object for that, the basic model, I don't have a black, the basic model there was one where a government's budget was a average tax rate applied to a tax base that was all of the income. So it was a flat tax on all income. That would be the government's budget constraint. And the budget constraint can be distributed between providing public goods on the one hand and collecting political rents on the other. That's the simplicity of it, which reduces it then to this billiards player, because the politician is outside of the game, and a vote is taken, and one or the other of the political candidates is selected that shifts the society. And so I was not at all comfortable with that whole formulation, because again, I think it illustrates that Pareto efficiency is built in the recipe, so to speak, in that kind of, but what it doesn't have is the only way you get rents in that model is if voters have particular preferences for one of the two competing politicians, because then voters will allow politicians to have some rent up to whatever the margin is where they say enough is enough. But then it's not really a rent, is it? Because then what it is it means you just like this politician more than the other. You'd rather see this one on TV than that one. And so what you're doing is not supporting the rent, but it's just buying another consumption good. And so that you don't have rents in that kind of formulation. And I think that's, again, is a quality of the framework that, and I think, as I see it, the way, if you find yourself facing a framework that draws you into thinking and accepting a certain outcome that just doesn't resonate with you, I think one thing you can do is ask whether the framework really makes any sense or whether there's some alternative frameworks, because then if you're not, if you're in that entangled world, then politicians and voters aren't in these separate spheres that they are in these Person, Tabalini, Bestley, and so forth types of models, but rather are on the same plane, interacting in various ways with partisans of their various enterprises. And that, again, I think, raised the possibility of getting into Jane Jacobs' world. And if I think with that world, it's a world that says that from today to the day after tomorrow, things might go on pretty well, and then again they might not. We know, just looking backwards at the historical record, that there's plenty of periods where things go along for long periods of time about the same as they seem to have. And there's also periods of very dramatic change in short periods of time, not always for the good. And in fact, again, to get back to the Worth Institute, and there was Central Europe, once upon a time, one time looked quite good, and then all of a sudden went through some very tumultuous times in very short order. And I think these are all the kinds of things that I think economics is a genuine social science. If it's going to come to grips with it, it has to come to grips with society as an ongoing, evolving, living kind of organism. And can't do it as an equilibrated organism that is subject to exogenous shocks, because all of the energy comes from inside the society and does not reside outside. What resides outside are just things like meteor collisions and that sort of thing, which aren't to be laughed at. Sure, they do lots of damage, but in terms of the subject matter that's, I think, of interest to us and should be of interest to us, it's the commotion is all internally generated. And I think sometimes that internal commotion works out for good, sometimes not so good. But those are all, I think, part of the challenges of coming better to understand how different constitutional filters might work to let through more of what might be desirable, and I happen to think it's in the direction of liberty, but also what might let through less of what might be undesirable. Also, I know, based upon my fondness of statistical decision theory, that there is no perfection that's achievable anyway.
George, I think you had a question.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things I've looked forward to in this conference is just learning more about this this entanglement model. And you mentioned that society as the unit should be the unit of analysis, and you argue that politics and economics, that those two realms are very interconnected and shouldn't be viewed separately, with one sort of impinging on the other. Just wondering though, if society is the unit of analysis, is society exhausted simply by the political and economic realms? Isn't there a cultural realm? I mean, even Adam Smith, for example, when The Wealth of Nations deals with, religion, for example, where do you see that fitting into this model? Is the moral somehow tied in with the political, or is it somehow outside political economy? Because it seems to me if we are going to go back to the way economics used to be done, which I'm all in favor of, people like Adam Smith looked at things that we would consider cultural, and specifically religion.
No, I'm in total agreement with you. I happen here to focus on the politics and economics, again, because one of the things that animated my effort to explore some of this was a reaction I had to the developments in the political economy literature that was taking place, and a growing realization that that literature was, I think, very badly distorting the object that it was trying to look at in ways that gave these kinds of conclusions of Pareto efficiency always and almost inevitably as a result of electoral competition. And so that just led to this architecture of market activities and political activities. But as I actually mentioned in my comment on Maria's presentation this morning, I very much think the cultural, moral are certainly they're of great interest and importance to me. And I think all these conceptions that we work with, again, these aren't objects like this, these saucers and plates on this table, and we can pick those up and examine their characteristics. They're not that kind of an object, that they're rather objects that we construct because that construction is going to be, we think it's going to be helpful in trying to get deeper into an understanding of that object. And so I think your questions about culture, morals, and so forth, I think, for instance, if you talk about private property as kind of an injunction, well, don't take it if it's not yours, to go back to something from Maria's this morning, then are political processes consonant with that, or are they contradictory to that? If you, for instance, there's, you know of a marshland, a 20-acre marshland, that you think would make a nice bird sanctuary. Well, if you think it's such a nice bird sanctuary and the birds are that of interest to you, you can go out and you can buy it, make an offer. Now, instead, what if you manage to convince a zoning commission or a legislative assembly to declare it undevelopable? Then what happens to the morality of private property and so forth? Because practice now is different. Practice says, well, if you want it badly enough to convince someone else to support you, you can take it. So that's a different practice. Now, if practice, see, in the classical theory of moral education, practice was, practice of good habits, desired habits, continued and reinforced, stopped being objects of thought and just became part of our second natures. And that was the basic, I think, classical theory of moral education, was practice was a teacher. But what kind of practice? The practice of commerce is one kind of practice that I think leads to such things as general truth telling, solicitation of other people's interests, looking for mutual gains and accommodations. A practice of taking it if you want it, all you need to do is convince some sufficient source of power to let you have it. That's a different kind of a practice. Now then how practice, if morality and culture are products of habit, and I think there's lots of I think, interesting conceptual potential for thinking of societies, in an important extent, being ecologies of habits. I think we underestimate how much importance there are to habits. I mean, sure, they're at some stage, initial stages of things we do, we think about them. But I think increasingly, as we do things and repeat them, we become comfortable in them. Those things become habits. And I think an important part of culture isn't something that is really in the foregrounds of our minds. Habits aren't in our foregrounds of our minds. Habits are out of sight. And I think this entanglement kind of concept, I think somehow speaks to that, or has the potential of speaking to that. But so, but, you know, I think any of these conceptions that, it comes down to what is going to allow us better to get a grip on something we think is important, but we can carry forward, and that's, so I think, anyway, you know, what we're talking about, I think, is economics, and this is really as social science. I'm just going back to what we mentioned, nothing more.
Okay. All right, other further questions?
I think the main next question is, where's the nearest watering hole? So, Richard, thank you so much, and appreciate it.